It's amazing.
Okay, we're going to finish the 4th chapter, and we're going to finish by talking about naming things and writing on things. We have one more chapter of Maaser Sheni to go, actually. There is a 5th chapter, but we'll see later this week that the 5th chapter takes a completely different tack. It really doesn't deal with Maaser Sheni at all. It deals more with Orla, with young trees. So this 4th chapter really is the conclusion of the Masechet, at least in terms of its base content. Many tractates actually of Mishnah have a chapter added on at the end that changes subject. So we're closing the chapter now, and we're closing on the question of stuff that is written down, or what its status is. Someone finds a vessel, a pot. He finds a pot, and the word korban is written on it. Korban means sacrifice. Can mean dedicated to holiness, but it means sacrifice, basically. Rabbi Yehuda says, if it was a clay pot, clay was really cheap in those days. It was a clay pot. If it's a cheap clay pot, we can assume that the pot itself is chulin. It has no holy status. But what is inside it would have been a sacrifice. In other words, we can assume that what was in the pot was used to contain something that was dedicated to the temple. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to make exactly the opposite supposition in the case of a valuable pot. It was a metal pot. Okay, now this is something special. Hu korban umash b'tocho, and he's going to make the opposite assumption. If it's a metal pot, the pot itself must have been dedicated to the temple. And you could dedicate anything to the temple in those days. You could dedicate yourself to the temple. So if it's an expensive pot, it has korban written on it, we assume that the pot was dedicated. But Rabbi Yehuda is making a big jump here. I mean, his first reasoning with the clay pot is rational. Cheap pot, we assume the contents were holy. Expensive pot, he's assuming the contents are not holy. And the sages say to him, and by the way, the halakha goes according to the sages here. It isn't the halakha in the case of the metal pot does not go according to Rabbi Yehuda. Ein derech bnei adam. It's not the way of man. Liot konsin chulin lekorban. You don't take ordinary food and put it into a pot that is dedicated to the temple. The assumption probably is that the food in it is dedicated to the temple as well. So it might be Maaser Sheni, it might be another kind of korban. But the assumption is that the food is holy. So we might ask, what if we don't have something written on it, but we have an abbreviation, so that the next Mishnah goes into abbreviations? So it begins exactly the same way. There's poetry in this Mishnah. The Mishnah 10 begins, Hamotzi chli, someone who vechatuv alav korban. And the next Mishnah begins, Hamotzi chli vechatuv alav kuf. So now you've just got one letter written on it. Someone finds a vessel and it just says kuf on it. The Mishnah says that's a korban. If it's a mem, that's maaser. If it's a daled, that's demai. Demai is produce that might or might not have had tithes separated from it. Tevel. Tevel is produce that definitely does not have tithes separated from it. Taf, truma. We learned about truma. Shebishat sakana hayu kotvin taf tachat truma. In times of danger, they used to write a taf instead of truma. Remember, the Mishnah is codified around 200 years into the Common Era. The years around after the Second Jewish Revolt, say around the time of the death of Rabbi Akiva, 125. So, and Rabbi Akiva and his contemporaries are really the voices we're hearing in the Mishnah. We've been learning about Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua. These are all people who lived around the year 125, and this was a period of These were the Hadrianic persecutions. This is a time of destruction and torture and death. The destruction of the land of Israel at that time was probably far greater in terms of its proportionate effect on the Jewish people than the Holocaust of the Second World War. And so the Mishnah is saying, bishat sakana, at a time of danger. This must be referring to that period. Hayu kotvim taf tachat truma. You wouldn't want to put right truma on a pot because you would then reveal the fact that you were keeping truma. So you just put a taf on it. You'd be a little bit anonymous. And Rabbi Yossi says, Kulam shmot b'nei adam. By the way, the halacha does not go according to Rabbi Yossi, just as it does not go according to Rabbi Yehuda. They could all be people's names, right? So this, if you had lots of different pots, maybe the initials refer to the person who owns the food in the pot. So a Daled would be Daniel. A Tough might be, I'm not sure who a Tough might be. Mem might certainly be Michael, and so on. Maybe they're all names of people. And Rabbi Yossi goes on to say, look, afilu matzah vehi melea perot. We found a barrel and it's full of fruit. Vechatuv aleha truma, and actually the word truma is written out in full on it. Haray elu chulin. You know, I can say that they're chulin, they're ordinary food, because I can say, look, maybe last year it was full of produce, of truma, and I wrote the word truma. Someone wrote truma on it last year. And remember, you can't rub out. It's not easy to erase writing that is written on a clay pot, right? So last year someone wrote truma on it. We've already learned, by the way, that a pot full of truma can be cleaned out. The last few odds and ends, sort of shaken out, swept out, and then you can use it for ordinary produce. So maybe last year it was truma, and this year it was emptied. And the halacha, by the way, doesn't go according. Rabbi Yossi doesn't. The halacha doesn't go according to Rabbi Yossi. Generally, the halacha gives people the benefit of the doubt, but not to that extent. And it certainly does in the next Mishnah, the final Mishnah of chapter 4, which again seems to be articulating we've seen up till now, right, that the sages very often bend over backwards. They make life very easy for the Jewish people to keep these mitzvot. And we're going to move from uncertainty about what is written on the pot, using an initial instead of a name, to uncertainty about really what is designated and spoken. So someone says to his son, Maaser Sheni b'zavit, there's some Maaser Sheni in that corner. And the son goes in and umatzah b'zavit acheret. The son goes into the storehouse and he finds food in some other corner. And the halacha is, Harei elu chulin. He hasn't found exactly what was predicted. That is chulin. He's found chulin in this corner. If his father says to him, there are 100, and the son finds 200, the remainder, the excess, is chulin. In other words, the son can assume that there was 100 there, but someone has added to it. And going in the other direction, hayasham maneu matzah ma'atayim umatzah maneh. Maybe he said to him there are 200, and he only found 100. Hakol Maaser. Everything is Maaser. In other words, we don't assume that someone took away the 200 and then brought back 100. If we're told, look, there was 200 in that corner and we found 100, well, okay, we might assume someone has taken away 100 of the Maaser Sheni, but what is left over is certainly Maaser Sheni. And that's the close of the 4th chapter. And that's actually all that we're going to learn in detail at this point about Maaser Sheni. We're going to take a big change of direction as we go into the 5th chapter. We're going to learn about Orla. So that is a treat for the next, for tomorrow evening, for the next Mishnah. So let me stop here and take any questions.
Hi, Benedict. This is Harold. The discussion about the symbols in times of distress. So the temple's destroyed in 70 AD, and things are very bad for the next century. But how long does the practice of Maaser, Sheni, or Teruma go on? Is it still practiced at the time of the writing of the Mishnah, or is this a discussion of laws that exist but were not practiced at the time?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. The Korbanot were clearly not practiced after that time because there was no temple. It was not possible. But the Mishnah talks about Truma and Maaser as if it is a live issue. And for example, Rabbi Eliezer, when he's talking about Truma, talks about it as it's a live issue. And there is a conversation between Rabbi Eliezer and one of his kids. This is all happening after the destruction, And Rabbi Eliezer is actually a little bit, he's not a little bit rude, he's actually very rude. He's actually very rude to a woman, a learned woman who asks him a question. And he basically tells her, that I don't talk Torah to women. And his son tells him off. His son says, you just lost us something like 100 kur, some vast quantity of Maaser. Because that woman is not going to give you Maaser anymore. Now you've been rude to her. So clearly, after the time of the destruction of the temple, people are still giving Maaser to Levi'im, and I presume Truma to Kohanim. And I presume the Kohanim are still are still consuming it, even though they can't eat it completely in purity, because they can't, they can't avoid defiling themselves. But I am presuming that people are still giving these offerings to the priests, even though the sacrificial service is no longer running, and other parts of the sacrificial system are breaking down. So I think that is what is going on.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, could normal people write, or is it just the priests who could write? Could normal people write letters? So, I mean, for example, how would you be able to write a letter on a plot?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, could people, well, first of all, yeah, so how literate were people in the time of, I mean, the Mishnah talks about the fact that there's a mitzvah, I mean, there's people talk about the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. I think we can assume that people can read. I think we're assuming that this is a society which is a literate society. Now, being able to write clearly is different from being able to read, and being able to have writing materials, right, is different from necessarily being able to read. And I mean, we have a lot of archaeological evidence of writing on potsherds from that kind of period, and people are writing casual letters on potsherds. So I think we got a reasonable amount of archaeological evidence of normal people writing things. These are not intellectuals writing things. I think we got archaeological evidence of normal people writing things on pottery. But maybe writing your name on an enormous jar, maybe that poses other problems. You know, you can't, I mean, even today, right, people just make simple marks on pots when they want to designate them as their own. You would, if your name was Simon Sebag Montefiore, you might not write the whole thing out quite painfully on a clay pot that wasn't taking paint very well. So you might just put an X on it to mark it as yours. I think that's what's going on with these abbreviations. But, you know, the Mishnah, when it says, okay, in times of danger, people would write tough for truma, it seems to be assuming that actually when you could write it out in full. So, yeah, I think we are presuming a society which is literate pretty much, very different from other societies of the time. But then there's a mitzvah of literacy. And people are kind of writing out what they can. That's sort of, that will be my baseline assumption.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, clearly people aren't writing out books. You know, to write a book, you had to be a trained solfaire. But writing out a word, yeah, I think people know how to write a word. Any other questions? Okay, good. Well, let me close for now. Thank you very much for conferencing in today. Tomorrow, we're going to change direction. So tomorrow's going to be really interesting, and I'll see you tomorrow afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.